So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Japanese Art and Civilization. We have a guest speaker, GeorgiaDorey, who created a company called In Praise of the Fold. GeorgiaDorey is just like you. She was a print major, like a print design major, and she has a master's degree in textiles print design from Royal College of Art, and she also lived in Japan for several years. So she is the one who truly understands the principles of Japanese textile or fabric art, I would say. It's a great pleasure that Georgia is here with us today. She's going to show her works inspired by traditional Japanese arts and crafts. So welcome, Georgia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. I'm GeorgiaDorey, a designer originally from the UK. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay. I studied at the Chelsea College of Art in London and completed a master's degree at the Royal College of Art, where I specialised in printed textiles. My work has been influenced and led by an ongoing study of Japanese textiles, and I've spent 2 years living and working in southern Japan. In 2018, I founded my brand In Praise of the Fold, which is inspired by Japanese culture and Japan. It's a space to celebrate the role that textiles play in our everyday lives. And since December 2019, I've been a research scholar at FIT, where I'm studying the influence of Japanese textiles and design in the USA. So I wanted to start with some of the key moments within my working career that lay the foundations for my study of Japanese textiles and design. And this is a painting by Vermeer, who was one of the 17th century Dutch old master painters. And the head covering and the bonnet often depicted on the women in these paintings have always fascinated me. These bonnets are not overly elaborate, but they are both structured and soft at the same time. They are almost cocooning the wearer's head. And I was fascinated by how these simple pieces of cloth were attached to the body. They appear to have been made from one length of cloth with minimal seams, and these coverings have been folded and wrapped around the head of the wearer. The concept of one dimension of cloth holding the possibility of multiple outcomes of shape and silhouettes seemed to me to be the perfect relationship between the body and cloth. And from this point, I became fascinated with how textiles were used to cover, dress, and cocoon the human form. And then in 2010, I saw the seminal exhibition at the Barbican Gallery in London about Japanese fashion. And the pieces shown in the exhibition were from the early 1980s to the present day. The garments were contemporary, but the influence of and connections to Japan's ancient design history was fascinating to me. It was in this exhibition where I first encountered the works of Issey Miyake, and these red jersey pieces you can see are from the line APOC, which stands for a piece of cloth. And here you can see the textile leads the design. The garments are literally born out of the length of cloth. This collection used the kimono as a springboard for its construction. On the left, you can see how the garments are cut from the lengths of red cloth. And on the right, you can see the 8 pieces that are cut from a single length of cloth to make one kimono. Kimono are made using the entirety of this length of cloth. And this collection by Miyake explores the potential uses of textiles with zero wastage. These pieces from the Comme des Garçons Spring-Summer 97 collection were also in the exhibition. And in 1997, at a time when other designers were doing everything they could to emphasize and accentuate feminine curves, Rei Kawakubo explored the idea that the clothes could be the body and the body could be the clothes. And there have been many different interpretations of the meaning and inspiration behind her collection, but in my mind, it is strongly connected to the Japanese tradition of padding the body when dressing in kimono. And here the body is distorted by the shapes and the clothes themselves, rather than the clothes being enslaved to the body. So on the left, you can see some of the different pads and the different structured pieces that you wear under the kimono to give you that willowy totemic form. And in the middle, you can see the little pads that are placed around the body. The lengths of the exhibition, the layout of the exhibition spoke to the significance of the materiality of space as well. And the lengths of textiles you can see here were used as temporary soft walls. And this was the first time I'd ever encountered textiles used in such a way. And I would later go on to learn that this was suggestive of the shoji screens and the significance of fabric in Japanese architecture. Making clothes is all about how to relate flat fabric to a three-dimensional form, which is the human body. European style fashion evolves, giving three-dimensional form to fabric by using curved lines and darts to fit it to the body. But Japanese designers are free from these European methods because of the notion of the kimono. And the kimono, in contrast to the construction of Western clothing, is an assemblage of rectangular pieces of fabric. And as a result, when not worn, the kimono is flat. And you can see on this piece on the right, it's made up of an assemblage of rectangles that are entirely flat, and the body underneath is what provides the volume. It is in the West, and when I refer to the West, I'm referring to Europe and North America. There is a divide between the disciplines of fashion and textiles. But it's evident to see in these designs that both traditional and contemporary designs, that the line between fashion and textiles is very, very blurred. And the fashion and the design and the construction of the textile are one and the same. And the Japanese art critic and philosopher, Soetsu Yanagi, who's the founder of the Minge folk craft movement, wrote, "All varieties of art, primitive, folk, aristocratic, religious, or individual, meet inequality at a topless, bottomless round table." And I believe that this equality of creativity is also evident in the textiles and design industry of Japan. Both are equally respected and celebrated. And the theme of the interconnectedness of creative disciplines is very important in my work as a designer. I believe it's important for textiles and fashion designers to work closely together. Who better to understand the cloth than the person who constructed it? The shape of the worn design on the right is almost secondary to the textile. It is not a question about using the textile to fulfill a predetermined design, but letting the cloth lead the design. And from this exhibition, I was struck by how the textiles used very much led the design of each piece. This respect and appreciation for material properties is something often prevalent in Japanese design. And this concept is something that has underpinned my practice ever since. This exhibition had a considerable influence on the development of my practice, and as demonstrated here in this collection I created for Kenzo in 2011, sorry. Which brings us to today's presentation, Material Respect, using Japanese textile traditions to inspire contemporary design. And I want you to think about this quote from trend forecaster Lee Eldercourt during today's presentation. Maybe you could write it down and refer to it throughout the presentation, which is, "Textiles are closer to humanity than any other medium." And I've separated my presentation into 4 sections. A brief summary of the significance of the role that textiles play in ancient and modern Japan, kimono and the concept of flatness, the multifunctional furoshiki wrapping cloth that comes alive through folding and wrapping, and the kesa and the significance of reuse in textiles. So the Jomon era is prehistoric Japan, and I find it fascinating that a whole era of Japanese history has been named after a textile pressing process. So these ceramic pieces are thought to be the oldest in East Asia and indeed the world. The surface of the ceramic themselves look like they could be a woven cloth. We use these early depictions, such as this one from the Tale of Genji scroll, as a tool to understanding the clothes and fashions of the past. But have you noticed just how much of the imagery is taken up by the garments? The cloth is almost what makes the image. It's a sea of textile folds and pools of cloth. And I would say that the textiles in this image account for close to 80% of the subject matter. And folds are seen again and again throughout Japan's textile history. Here you can see the layers and the layers of the folds, the jinahatue. The textiles are spilling out over the edge of the platform. And you can see there are some musical instruments amongst the people there, but they're almost camouflaged by the layers of cloth. The cloth is dominating the image. And this concept of volume and layering of textiles is so important in Japanese culture that there is a word for it, which is ma, a belief that space between the layers and folds of a garment is more than simply a void, but rather a rich space that can possess a vast energy. And even in more realistic scenes of Japan, the textile and the cloth dominates the image. This is a scene of a harbour, and in the background you see the harbour, but it's almost muted in comparison to the textiles and cloth worn on the body. And I would really encourage you to really examine these prints whenever you get a chance to see them, just to see the amount of detail that has gone into the colour and the pattern of the textiles. It truly is mesmerising. And beyond the clothes that the people wore, fabric plays an important role in Japanese life in many other ways. The role of textiles in architecture, for example. A kicho is a portable multi-paneled silk partition. It was first used in the Heian period when it became a standard piece of furniture. And this speaks to the concepts of softness and the significance of cloth within the culture. And starting in the Heian period, this practice of cloth serving as a barrier still exists today. These cloth curtains, called norin, fulfill several roles. They act as a partition to separate the inside from the outside of a home or a business, and they also carry a more practical function like a billboard or a sign. It is thought that the norin also enhance a curiosity and expectation as to what is behind the cloth. These are images I took in Kyoto back in 2019, and the one on the right is a sign for a ceramics shop. Another example of the connectedness to material and space within the Japanese culture is tatami mats. Tatami mats are, excuse me, woven from rice straw, and they are what line the floors of traditional Japanese homes, apartments, and tea houses. And you can see on the floor in the image on the left and the image on the right, the different time frames, but the dimension is the same and they are visually the same. They are used as a measurement of space, and one size of one tatami mat is based on the length of one person lying down on the floor. And the size of these tatami mats changes from prefecture to prefecture within Japan, depending on the average size of the people that live in that area. So this way of measuring space puts the human at the very center and the textile as its tool. And I became really fascinated with this, how the size of a body could help you to understand a space in a more tangible way, making my own measuring device inspired by the tatami mats. And textiles within the tea ceremony, they play a key role, and they are used to store as well as to clean and to cleanse the implements used, and as temporary soft surfaces to serve tea and Japanese sweets. At the end of the tea ceremony, it's not uncommon for these textile pieces to be laid out in front of the guests for them to examine. That's just how significant they are. And on the right is an image I took in 2019 of a pouch to hold a tea caddy. And the image in the middle, you can see the image, it's almost unchanged, that same pouch, the way it's used. And now I want to talk about kimono and the ideas of flatness. Firstly, just to talk about the construction of a kimono, and the process itself is steeped in tradition. The reason why the kimono fabric is 38 to 45 centimeters wide is largely due to the structural limitations of the hand loom. About 40 centimeters is believed to be the best size for throwing a shackle across the warp. And looms were also smaller because they were often used in people's homes. And even though today kimono fabric could be woven in a different way, it's culturally significant to use this size of loom. However, recently, many of Japanese people's heights and physical measurements are getting bigger, So kimono producers are using slightly larger looms to produce larger bolts of cloth. And economy of fabric. So the kimono, as you know, is made from one continuous length of cloth called a tanmono, which is the top left image. So one length of cloth would be 12 meters and enough to make one kimono. All of the fabric was used and resulting in minimum wastage. And on the right, you can see the selvage edge, which has been folded over where there would have been a seam. And often prints will stop at that point so that none of the print is wasted when sewing up the garment. And the kimono is made from one single bolt of cloth and doesn't require any sort of tailoring. The fit is altered by the obi sash, so it's a one-size-fits-all concept. And at the top, you can see the layout for cutting out the 8 pieces that make the kimono, and underneath is a Western approach to pattern cutting, which uses significantly more cloth and has a lot more wastage. And care of kimono. So kimono is best kept folded flat for storage rather than kept on a coat hanger. And then it can be opened up and worn again without ironing. And this is a video I took back in 2017, where I was learning the correct methods for folding the kimono ready for storage. A lot of it is based on the seams as to where you're folding the textile. And then the care of kimono. So the kimono is best kept folded in storage, as we've talked about, but most significantly is the structure of the kimono. So it's made up of 8 individual lengths, and they are sewn together in such a way that they can then be unsewn, and each length is washed, like the top right image, and then dried on those boards at the top, on the bottom, sorry, bottom right image. And then they can be then sewn back together into a kimono, or they can be folded and stored for other uses. And in direct contrast to the principles of the kimono are the European traditions of garment construction. So these are early 19th century European fashions on the left, and on the right you have early 19th century fashions of Japan. So you have the curves and extreme proportions versus the willowy columns. And in the summer of 2020 in London, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, there was an exhibition called Kimono, Kyoto to Catwalk. It explored the sartorial, aesthetic and social significance of kimono from the 1660s to the present day, both in Japan and the rest of the world. And in this exhibition case here, you can see on the left is a kimono in its intended state from the early 19th century. And second from the right is a tea gown that was remade from identical kimono cloth that had been imported into London in 1876. The kimono cloth has been remodeled to fit European tastes of the time. And this is an illustration from a book called The Kimono Mind by Bernard Rudowski, and it says, to Japanese eyes, Western trousers had all the elegance of a hollowed out tree trunk. And I think it's important to note that this was written in 1965, so some of the wording is outdated, but he wrote, most Oriental clothes are the antithesis of Western ones. They are cut, if at all, along geometric lines, squares, rectangles, or circles, which prompts us to call them shapeless. Whereas Oriental clothes are innocent of the body's curves, Western clothes are constructed with an eye to anatomy. Intricately shaped, stiffened and moulded, they represent a sort of hollowed casting of their owner. Between airings, they hang like human effigies from the gallows of our clothes closets. And this is an interesting example of when Japanese fabric and Western style is combined. This dress was made from authentic kimono fabric imported to America from Japan. The textile itself was originally intended for a woman of the samurai class, and this piece is in the FIT Museum archive. I spent quite a bit of time studying this gown, and you can see the blue kimono cloth is used down the middle and down the back and on some of the details, and how it's been adapted into this very curved Western silhouette. This piece cannot be taken apart like the kimono can, and it can't be used for anything else. As you can see on the left, all the many seams and the linings mean that although it's very well made, it's a type of throwaway fashion in contrast to the kimono. And on the right, you can see all the many fastenings, which again is in direct opposition of what the kimono stood for. And this is just illustrating how the pink taffeta accounts for 46 plus pieces of the dress's construction, and not forgetting the lining cloth as well. And the embroidered blue crepe of the kimono has been cut into 10 pieces, 5 long lengths and 5 small pieces for the pockets, cuffs and collar. There will have been a sufficient amount of the blue kimono cloth left over, and I wonder where the remnants of that blue fabric are now. And in contrast, the 8 simple lengths that the original kimono would have been made from. It's quite a difference. And here is just another short video from the exhibition at the V&A, just showing how beautifully the 8 pieces of cloth come together. And 100 years later, another combination of Japanese and European traditions that is more respectful of the fabric. A United States-based Japanese fashion designer, Hiromi Asai, believes that the true essence of the kimono is not its shape, but the cloth itself. Asai has developed a larger width loom that uses the same kimono weaving methods, but ensures she can work with larger and longer lengths of cloth. Mirroring the one-size-fits-all nature of the kimono is the furoshiki. A furoshiki is a square piece of cloth that can be used to carry and wrap any number of objects. So this is a short video, it's not mine, but it just illustrates some of the methods of using the furoshiki that's still used today in Japan. Let's see if I can get it to work. Speed through it so you can see. And when I was living in Japan, it wasn't uncommon to see these methods being used on a daily basis. It's very much along the same vein as an eco bag. So you're layering the base of the shopping basket. She later wraps up using smaller furoshiki. When I was living in Japan, I documented a lot of the uses for the furoshiki. I'm sure everyone thought I was very odd. And then at the end, she brings together the 4 corners. There are lots of wonderful videos on YouTube that you can follow along with this method, the one dimension of cloth used for multiple outcomes. And off she goes with her shopping. And then when she gets home, she's ready to unpack. So the furoshiki can be really quite large and also very, very small, and can be used to wrap anything from a wardrobe to an apple. It's been used since the Heian period and can be seen in use throughout historical imagery. And if you now look out for it within woodblock prints, you will see it everywhere. Used in all different ways, the ultimate functional textile of Japan. And I'm building up a library of images, collecting the varying uses of the furoshiki. There are not many old or new examples of furoshiki in museum collections, excuse me, as they were such commonplace and mundane tools. Even now in Japan, they are not seen as particularly interesting. This one here I've studied is from the V&A archive, and you can see the 2 corners are reinforced with stitching to ensure that it's extra sturdy when being used. But as I say, this is one of the only ones that they have in the archive that you can gain imagery of, because they just weren't seen as very important artifacts. Excuse me. And I have my own range of wrapping cloths inspired by the froshki that I make and design. So in the West, we often design packaging around a shape, and this results in unwanted packaging materials. However, the froshki is one square shape of cloth used to wrap an array of items. So it's a one size fits all. These are examples of the use of the froshki. So in the bottom there, bottom right, you can see the froshki covering as a temporary pillowcase. And then there's next to that, to the left, there's that's a 2-bottle fold, and that can also be used to wrap and transport trainers and shoes when traveling. And then you've got the pairs that are being held there in a bag format, and then the top right is a vase that has been wrapped. So it's just an incredible tool that really can be used to wrap just about anything. It's often used also to wrap bento boxes at lunchtime, and you unwrap your bento box, like the image in the bottom left, and then you lay it out on the table like an impromptu tablecloth. And these are some of the designs that I've created. Japanese froshki are traditionally printed with seasonal, or they're inspired by the seasons and seasonal motifs. So I have used seasonal botanicals from my own culture to combine with this fascinating history. This froshki is used by all levels of Japanese society, and it's a very famous pattern. It's known, I've been told by a friend of mine, it's known as the froshki for thieves and robbers, because the pattern on the outside is that of vines that the robber would climb up the side of your house, lay the froshki down, fill it up with all of your valuables, tie it up, and then climb back down the vines again with a heavy bundle. So that's an old folk story from Japan that's quite fascinating. And this is, beyond the beauty of the gifting of the froshki, this is a purely practical example. This is one I picked up in Kyoto, and this is an emergency preparedness froshki. So it's reflective, and it's also waterproof. So it can be used in many different practical ways, and the illustration on the outside illustrates these, such as a sling, to carry a baby, as a screen to change behind. And emergency preparedness is a very real thing you need to be prepared for when living in Japan, because they have a lot of tsunamis and earthquakes. And then here is another image. It's from 2016 from a market in Kyoto. And just seen in a trading environment. It's just square pieces of fabric used in place of a plastic bag. And then this is a wrapping cloth. This is a more elaborate and ceremonial version of the froshki. This is called a fukuza, and this is it's meant that it was never folded or wrapped, but it was laid over a gift and then presented, and like a very fancy wrapping paper. So this fukuza was presented to an Englishman at the Emperor's Palace in Japan in 1874, but the Englishman didn't realize that it was supposed to be then returned to the giver, and he was too polite to tell him, so he took it away with him, and now this piece is in the V&A archive. But you can see the embroideries on the right there are three-dimensional almost, so you would never fold this. This would have just been laid over. And on the other side of the wrapping cloth spectrum is the tanuki, which is a long rectangular cloth, often with raw selvage edges. And it's as old as the froshki, but it's used for more everyday reasons, as seen here. And it's used in a similar way to a handkerchief. So you have the levels of importance of wrapping cloth: the tanuki, the froshki, and the fukuza. And it's clear to see the threads of connection that join the concept of flatness and folding seen in both the kimono and the froshki. So combining the ideas of the froshki and the kimono and working from these connections, I developed this collection called Wrap. So each piece is made entirely flat, but instead of the traditional square of the froshki, I've explored the possibility of other wrapping shapes. So on the left, you see the garment entirely flat, and on the right, you can see it worn on the body. So flat shapes come to life when worn on the three-dimensional forms. And the furoshiki wrapping cloths, as I said previously, come in many different print designs and colorways, and often the print determines or suggests the use of the furoshiki or reflects the seasons. So in this collection, I tried to use the print design to suggest the different feeling and mood of each of the pieces. So the pinks are a lot softer, and silks and chiffons, and then the blues were much more sturdy cloth. So the pieces provide gentle concealment and they cocoon the wearer. So you get multiple outcomes from the same shape of cloth. So you can see here the same shade of cloth is used as a cloak, and then you can see at the bottom it's folded in half and used as a skirt. So the same way that you would be using the square cloth of the furoshiki to wrap different shapes. This is what I've explored in this collection. And then I wanted to highlight the fact that the furoshiki is often used on various different shapes and sizes, and I didn't want the pieces I'd made from my collection just to look like they were only intended for the body. So I created these totemic forms to suggest that they would cover other shapes and sizes. I wanted to show that they could be used for any number of shapes and sizes, adapting and changing in relation to their use, like the furoshiki. And being exhibited on these forms also speaks to the notion of the one-size-fits-all of the kimono, and they're tightened around the body with cloth sashes that were inspired by the obi. And then this work was exhibited at a show in Maastricht in the Netherlands. And now the final section of my presentation, I wanted to talk about the kessa, which is a Buddhist monk's robe, and themes of reuse in contemporary design today. So this is a fragment of 18th century cloth from Japan, and it resides in the FIT Museum archive. This textile would have originally been used as part of a kimono. Once the kimono was worn, it would have been taken apart and the lengths of cloth would have been reused, as we spoke about previously. And one of the uses for these fragments would have been to make kessa. And kessa were shawls, these long pieces of fabric patchworked together that were made from old and worn kimonos that were donated to monasteries. And you can see the monk on the left is wearing a kessa over his left shoulder. It was always worn over the left shoulder. And because of this second life that the textile was given, even in fragmentary form, some of the most unique and ancient textiles of Japan from the 17th to 19th century have been preserved. So this textile was made at the same time as the kimono on the right from the Tokyo National Museum. You can see the design and the pattern is very, very similar. So perhaps the piece on the right was in better condition, so it wasn't deemed necessary to donate or to give away to the monasteries. And then this is a really interesting piece because they cite that the fabric was woven between 1580 to 1620, but then the kessa was then made between 1700 and 1850. So it just shows you where the fabric began, and initially it was made as a robe for a no actor, and then it went through its lifespan of being used and ends up being used as a kessa. And the Tokyo National Museum actually has an identical robe, kimono, that is this exact fabric. So I would think it would be really wonderful to be able to see the two next to each other, to see that lifespan of the textile. And this collection of my work, entitled Silver Birch, was inspired by these themes of reuse and respect for material. So this entire collection is made from scraps of material that would have otherwise been thrown away. And to develop textile print and texture, I used various hand techniques so as not to have to spend more and buy more and invest in buying more fabrics, but rather using what I already had to create the pattern. And what these designs have in common is that it's only when they are worn that do they take their final form, and the movement causes them to require further unexpected shapes. And all of these pieces are entirely flat again. There's a front and a back, but no intended sides. And there are no fastenings either. It's only ties have been used. And then this collection was exhibited at Brighton Fashion Week. In summary, my practice is about the exchange of knowledge and sharing of Japanese culture, and radical creativity is a key thread that runs through my work. I use my creative practice as a tool to learn, document, teach, discover, and create. And my most recent work is called Makers and Made, a journal of Japanese creativity. It's an interdisciplinary study achieved through open, involved, and direct engagement within archives, communities, collectors, makers, and specialists. Each volume brings together those who work through a deep admiration for the broad spectrum of creative traditions from Japan, and celebrates and deepens our understanding of Japanese art, craft, culture, and design in the USA. So the journal will take the form of a series of short essays, case studies, observations, and artworks that I will produce and respond to each individual that I'm talking with. The first journal will launch at the end of spring, and this edition will be talking to this ceramicist, Miwa Neishi, who's Tokyo born and lives and works in New York and sells her work at the Noguchi Museum. I talk with Miwa-san about the inspirations behind her work, prehistoric Japanese figurines from the Jomon period, and the forms and shapes of Japanese kanji, as well as the connection she feels to the work and experience of Japanese American artist and sculptor Isamu Noguchi. I also talk with Sebastian Izard, who's a New York-based British specialist of Japanese woodblock prints, who has over 40 years of knowledge and experience, and I talk to him about the significance of textiles within the woodblock prints. I talked to Naoko Teiki Moore, who's also known as Mrs. Donabe, who owns a homeware store in LA, and she brought the idea of one-pot cooking in these Japanese donabe dishes to the USA. And I talked to her about her role in the changing landscape of Japanese cooking in the USA and what the donabe dish can teach us about Japanese culture. And lastly, I introduce Yukako Satone, who's a registered Saori weaving teacher who has 2 spaces in New York. She talks to us about the therapeutic benefits of this traditional Japanese weaving method. So this journal, Makers and Made, aims to reflect Japan's more holistic approach to creative endeavor by inviting the reader on a pilgrimage to observe similarities, celebrate differences, and create dialogue between the makers and the made in America today. So thank you very much. I think you can ask questions now, and if you want to get in touch, these are my details. My website's currently undergoing some maintenance, so it's not live at the moment, but it will be again soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgia. And everybody, if you have an emoticon, you can show, your clapping gestures or, anything. And Georgia, if you stop sharing,
Yes.
you can also see everybody on the screen. You can see our enthusiastic applause with the emoticons. So
stop sharing.
If you go all the way on the top, there is red button. So FIT students, if you can turn on your camera. Now we are back to this grid mode. So we only see each other once a week, occasionally face to face. So if you can turn on the camera. And do you have any questions for Georgia? Any question is fine, because we are all, most of us are aspiring artists, right? So you can ask what her operation cost is or whether she needs assistance, right? Any question? You can raise a hand, or any comment, you can show your admiration for her work. Any comment? Devin, do you have a question or comment?
Yes. So how could us as striving designers apply this sort of concept in our work? And how can we make it useful to people? That makes sense in like the market of fashion.
Yeah, I think I suppose I'm sure you all have your own inspirations and ideas that you're working towards within your work. I suppose with my work, it's taking strains of something that is a key inspiration to me and reimagining it in today's world, and how we might adopt some of those ideas in ways that can enhance the ways that we're living and functioning today. So I'm not sure what your key inspirations are, but I think looking to history in this way can provide so much inspiration and be so useful as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm currently in the intimate apparel specialization, so I'm like trying to reimagine the idea of less waste in that arena, because it's such like a intricate, like you were saying, the Japanese idea is like these straight pieces that are cut with minimal waste, whereas intimate a lot of times is like these crazy pattern pieces that are cut, and you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
synthetic fabrics and
Yeah, and I think the thing that I often come back to is thinking about also the idea of the tatami mat, and how the idea of space is so specific to an individual. And if you could think about space in relation to your own size and your own environment, that would be helpful in understanding how much space we actually need as a tool of measurement. I think that's also interesting to think about when thinking about concepts of waste.
those are revolutionary ideas.
Thank you, Devin. And then somebody else have a question?
I had a question.
Okay.
I just typed it in the chat too, but I love that video of the furoshiki being used to wrap up the groceries and kind of make like package the things individually and then make the bag. Because I mean, I'm always thinking about packaging waste and just all of the waste we produce. Do you think that type of technique would ever be widely accepted in Western culture? Or like, I just worry that people always look for like the easiest, fastest route and cheapest route and whatever, but it would be so like I'm just wondering like how can that become more widely accepted, because it's really cool.
That's a good question, and it's something that I'm always contending with, because it's an interesting concept, but as you say, how can you apply that to everyday life, and how can you be consistent about it? And I suppose it's just a case of practicing it and just bringing it out. And when you would usually, like we used to always just go to the supermarket and they would just give us our groceries in plastic bags, whereas now it's taken time, but now I think, no, remember your furoshiki, remember your bag, and then you go. And I think it's just the idea of practicing it, and with time you realize that it can come in handy. But I suppose moving forward as well, we could look to other methods of other materials that could be used, like with packaging and like with delivering things from Amazon or whatever, like just looking at the materials that they're made from. I mean, it's a whole world to be discovered, but I have no doubt there are ways, but I think it's just firstly, I think just starting in your own life to practice it actively, and then you can start to see things that need improving. Like I now am working on a bag inspired by the furoshiki wrapping cloth, but pre-folded, so that you don't have the pressure of having to understand how to use it, to become comfortable with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Somebody else? Well, last time when Georgia was here, I was asking her how much it cost to get the outfit. And what did you say last time? It's like a whole, like a dress, ensemble was a few $1,000, right?
It's something that at the moment, it's still at the point where to take it to the next stage where it could be produced and purchased, it still needs some fine tuning, because at the moment they're very much standalone pieces. And of course, it would be great to use it at that, to be able to sell at that price point. But I think talking about trying to integrate these ideas in a more accessible way, it definitely needs further development to get to that point. But yes, quite expensive at the moment.
No, but I think it makes sense because you have to think about your labor, right? And then your own resources that was poured into the production of this either prototype piece or one of the kind, design. And that's also something that students should think about. We sometimes don't think about the cost of our own labor, right? Like you will say, well, I spent $600 to buy this fabric and so forth, but you have to put into your like a monthly rent, or if you, just like a car, if you purchase your sewing machine, you also have to put how much of that cost to put into this garment, right? So that like as a business operation, you also have to think that side and then decide, is it really viable as a business operation, or what else do I have to do more, right? Yeah.
And that's something that I think would be good for you all to start getting comfortable with now, because it then gets easier as you progress throughout your career. It's always you just sort of trial and error, but you do have a certain base level of costs that need to be met. But I think just stepping into that space of taking your labor seriously is so important to start doing now. Yeah.
So anybody else about the process, creative process, or where Georgia gets her supplies? So can you mention a little bit about the supplier of your fabric? Like those are like imported from Japan, or how do you procure your material? You want to save it from how can I say, garment factory floors as well, right?
Yes, yeah. When I visit Japan on research trips, I'm always buying up lengths of cloth, but it is often from factories or studios where it's sort of sitting idle, which you will always end up with less cloth than you may need, but then you're kind of forced to think more creatively with what you can do with that cloth. So I always try to use cloth that would otherwise be going to waste, which is obviously fantastic for concepts of reuse, but also it's much more affordable as well when purchasing.
And I want to ask one more question about your principles of cultural appropriation. I know you spent quite some time in Japan, and you also understand the language a little bit, and you are the one who put a lot of effort into learning other culture, right? Culture other than yours, and you also bring it up to global dissemination as well. And I think it's a great example of learning other people's culture. And I have this conversation very often with my students in Asian Art Survey and also history of East Asian costume. And students often ask us, then who other than Japanese people have entitlement to wear Japanese kimonos, right? And then I will say, well, if you go to Japan or here, you see these non-Japanese people who learned the Japanese language for 30-some years, not related, in terms of a family relationship, but somebody who truly understands other people's culture really well and appreciate it and always maintain the respect for that culture other than yours. And I certainly believe that those people have all the rights to dress up in kimono if they want to, because they can explain all those symbolic values and traditions and other things. It's not just the one casual or whimsical idea that, well, I want to dress like a Mexican, with a sombrero. it's a Halloween, right? It's not, somebody truly understands the culture and, history behind it. So can you share your principles of not to commit, unethical practice of cultural appropriation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a constant learning process. And even the way I approached my work 2 years ago is changed to how I do it now. It's just constantly looking outwards to be informed and to learn. And also referring, I'm fortunate that I have a lot of colleagues still in Japan and in London and in New York that I can also talk with and get feedback from and just check myself. And it's always changing. Things that, as I said, things I would have done previously, I now know better. And I think if you're investing the time and you're doing everything you can to be respectful, that there is a fine line between appropriation and appreciation. And it's just always trying to stay on the right side of that. But I think not to let it put you off, though, just to maintain respect and to let it inform you, but to then apply it in ways looking into the future. I think that's how I try to approach it.
Thank you so much. It's a very conscientious way of, constant research, right? As you just said, your perception of other people's culture when you are 25 is also very different when you are now 45, right? And then thinking back, I lived through this, tradition for 20 some years, right? And also tradition changes over time too. What Japanese people perceive of their own history or their own tradition changes over time as well, right? Is there any more questions, everybody?
Any question?
Okay, I guess students are, rather shy. Now you are currently based in Tokyo, right? So do you have any comments?
Well, I'm not in Tokyo. I'm in the prefecture called Shizuoka. It's like literally in the middle of Japan. But actually my city is famous for textiles. Well, it used to be famous for textile dyeing. So the technique is called chusen dyeing. So it uses this mold to dye fabric. And I think one of the main characteristics of that specific dyeing called chusenzome is that you can actually use both sides of the fabric, I thought. And I actually made kimono, yukata for myself before in my home ec class.
That's incredible. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I can send you a picture.
Please do.
Yeah, so which part of Japan were you living?
I was in Kagoshima.
Oh, I was there last week.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So lucky you.
I went to Yakushima. It was one of my, I don't know, longest dream I had in my life, because flying to Kagoshima or Yakushima from Shizuoka is kind of hassle.
Yeah, it's far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember before I left to move to Japan, I bumped into some Japanese people in London, and I told them I was moving to Japan. I was so excited, and they asked me where I was going, and I said Kagoshima, and they were like, "Why would you go there? It's farming town." I was like, "I know, but isn't that amazing? It was so much of it felt so traditional and so authentic. It was a beautiful place."
Yeah, my grandpa was born in Kagoshima and he grew up in Kagoshima, but it was actually my first time in Kyushu, or outside of Honshu. Well, besides traveling abroad, or I mean I study in FIT for more than 3 years, 4 years so far. So yeah, I mean, it was my first time flying Kyushu, and it was really exciting seeing the other part of Japan, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so pleased. I miss it so much.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because of COVID, there are like, like a lot less foreigners living in Japan or like, like traveling to Japan. So it's quite a bummer.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, just for FIT students who don't know what Kagoshima means, it's more like a southern part, like like a southern part of Kyushu Island that you studied in the map of Japan. And then Kagoshima people have a strong dialect, right? Like it's almost like a foreign language in Japan. Imagine people living in Texas, like they have a dialect too, right? Like it's that kind of, oh, you are from like a Kagoshima. Sort of very folksy, country style. There are a lot of humors about Kagoshima dialect. But just to share my story, like we have that Chano Youth Center in Upper East Side. And when I take this particular class, like Japanese art class, every single time our teacher was a little short Japanese man, old man. He used to be a carpenter, but he originally came from Kagoshima. But he became a tea master. He practiced for 35 years. And I heard he just retired. So I'm going to miss him when I take my Japanese art class to that Chanoyu Center for next time. But we really had an authentic experience sitting on the tatami and holding the bowl. And we watched that Ikebana. Remember our assignment, building your own tea room? But they have a replica of authentic Japanese tea room in the middle of 65th Street and 3rd Avenue. It used to be painter Mark Rothko's studio. Anyhow, yeah, Kagoshima reminds me of that old Japanese tea master. He said he was quite ashamed of his Kagoshima dialect when he came to New York. Other Japanese people didn't understand him. Like, oh.
Yeah, it's strong.
But anyhow, yeah, that was an experience. But if you don't have any more questions, I will let our guest speaker, Georgia, leave. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
But by the way, have you met that designer, Hitomi Asai?
I
Hiromi
haven't.
Asai? Her studio is near FIT. I was about to go to a special panel in Los Angeles, Japanese Center. I was a moderator, to interview Hiromi Asami. So, Hiromi Asai. So we were exchanging email each other, but her studio is nearby, like somewhere in Garment District.
That's where I heard about her. I visited the Japan House in LA, and they were telling me about her.
Yeah, so after that, after you introduced me to her studio, we were exchanging emails each other. So maybe next year, everybody, when I teach Japanese art again, I should invite that designer herself, right? Like that would be fun.
A studio visit, if we're allowed to visit things again.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So anyhow, thank you so much, Georgia, for coming to FIT again one more time. Yeah. And your lecture is being recorded, so I'm going to share it with you. So now I'm going to stop recording.